Hey there, horror fans. Welcome back to my channel, where we dive into the darkest corners of the supernatural and the unexplained. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling tale. Tonight, I've got a bone-chilling story that's going to keep you on the edge of your seat. We're heading into the haunting halls of St. Augustine's Hospital, a place with a dark past and even darker secrets. Imagine walking through an old, abandoned hospital late at night, where the air is thick with the scent of decay and the walls seem to close in around you. But beware, because once you step into Ward 13, there's no turning back. So, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready for a spine-tingling journey into the unknown. This is the Silent Ward. Let's dive in. Sure. Here's a horror story set in a hospital with plenty of suspense, thrills, and eerie scenes. Hashtag title, The Silent Ward. The old St. Augustine's Hospital loomed in the distance, a relic of the past surrounded by the encroaching tendrils of a foggy night. Built in the late 1800s, it had once been a place of hope and healing, but now it stood forgotten, its Gothic architecture crumbling, its windows darkened and lifeless. A place where memories lingered like ghosts, where whispers of the past echoed through its decaying halls. Dr. Emily Carter had always been drawn to the macabre, to the forgotten corners of history where the shadows were deepest. It was why she had taken the assignment at St. Augustine's, despite the warnings from her colleagues. They spoke of strange occurrences, of patients disappearing without a trace, of a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. But Emily was not one to shy away from a challenge, especially one as intriguing as this. As she approached the hospital, her heart quickened. The fog thickened, swallowing the world around her, leaving only the looming silhouette of the building ahead. She parked her car and stepped out, the cold air biting at her skin. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under her feet as she made her way to the entrance. The front doors creaked open with a push, revealing a dimly lit lobby. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faint smell of antiseptic and decay. The receptionist's desk was empty, the computer dark, as if the building itself had been abandoned. Emily hesitated for a moment, a chill running down her spine, but then shook it off. She was here to do a job, and she wasn't going to let a little unease stop her. She made her way down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. They depicted doctors and nurses in stiff white uniforms, their expressions solemn. Emily paused in front of one, her eyes drawn to a particular face in the crowd. A woman, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes hollow and distant. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that seemed to follow Emily as she moved. Shaking off the feeling, Emily continued down the hall. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. She passed room after room, their doors ajar, revealing empty beds and abandoned medical equipment. It was as if the hospital had been evacuated in a hurry, leaving everything behind. Finally, she reached the ward where she was supposed to be working. It was at the far end of the hospital, isolated from the rest of the building. The sign above the door read, Ward 13. Emily couldn't help but smile at the cliché. Of course, it would be Ward 13. The door creaked open as she pushed it, revealing a long corridor lined with patient rooms. The lights were dim, casting a sickly yellow glow. The air was colder here, and the silence was oppressive. Emily could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She walked down the corridor, peeking into the rooms as she passed. Most of them were empty, the beds neatly made, the monitors silent. But in some, she could see the shapes of figures lying under the covers, their faces turned away from her. She felt a pang of unease. Were they sleeping? Or were they something else? As she reached the end of the corridor, she found the nurse's station. It was a small, cramped space, cluttered with paperwork and old medical charts. A single lamp illuminated the desk, casting a pool of light in the darkness. Emily set down her bag and pulled out her laptop, ready to begin her work. But as she reached for the keyboard, she noticed something strange. The charts on the desk were old, far older than they should have been. The dates on them were from the 1950s, the ink faded and smudged. The names of the patients were unfamiliar, and yet something about them felt familiar, as if she had seen them somewhere before. Emily's fingers hovered over the keys, a sense of dread creeping over her. She pushed it aside and began to type, focusing on the task at hand. She had been assigned to review the hospital's records, to sort through the mess of paperwork and digital files that had accumulated over the years. It was a tedious job, but one that needed to be done. Hours passed as Emily worked, the silence of the ward broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. She lost herself in the records, reading through the notes of doctors long gone, the stories of patients who had come and gone. But the more she read, the more uneasy she became. The records were filled with strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, patients who had simply vanished without a trace. There were reports of shadowy figures seen in the corridors, of whispers in the dark, of a presence that seemed to linger just out of sight. And always, there was the mention of Ward 13, as if it held some dark secret that no one dared to speak of. As the night wore on, Emily felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, and her head ached from the strain of reading. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after midnight. She should have gone home hours ago, but something kept her here, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The silence of the ward pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let the darkness take her. When she opened her eyes, the ward was different. The dim light was gone, replaced by a flickering, sickly green glow. The walls were no longer pristine white but stained with dark, wet patches that pulsed as if alive. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and decay, and the silence had been replaced by a low, humming sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, the chair screeching loudly against the floor. She reached for her bag, but it was gone, along with her laptop. The nurse's station was empty, the papers scattered across the floor. Panic surged through her as she realized that she was alone, trapped in a place that had twisted into something nightmarish. She stumbled out of the station and into the corridor. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. The humming grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. She walked down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The doors to the patient rooms were all closed now, the small windows in them black and uninviting. She could feel eyes on her, watching her from behind the doors, but she didn't dare look. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, on the end of the corridor, where a single door stood ajar. The door to room 13. Her heart raced as she approached it, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a room bathed in shadows. The bed in the center was empty, the sheets rumpled as if someone had just left. But it was the figure standing in the corner that drew her attention. It was the woman from the photograph, the one with the hollow eyes. But she was no longer just a figure in a picture. She was real, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around her face, her eyes empty and soulless. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile as she turned to face Emily. "Welcome, doctor," she whispered, her voice a rasping hiss. "We've been waiting for you." Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Emily turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the apparition. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, as the walls began to close in, the shadows reaching out to engulf her. The woman's laughter echoed in the room, a sound that chilled Emily to the bone. "Don't be afraid," the woman said, her voice distorted, as if it was coming from all around her. "You're one of us now." Emily screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as the shadows closed in, swallowing her whole. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, twisted into a mask of horror, before everything went black. When Emily woke again, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the nurse's station. The lights were back to their dim yellow glow, the walls white and pristine once more. The air was still and silent, the humming gone. She sat up, her body trembling with fear. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But as she looked around, she saw the papers scattered across the floor, the computer still dark, and the door to room 13 still ajar. A sense of dread settled over her as she realized that whatever had happened, it hadn't been a dream. Something was wrong with this place, something dark and twisted. And it wasn't going to let her go. She grabbed her bag and ran, not stopping until she was outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. The fog had lifted, revealing the dark, empty streets around the hospital. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock her car. She drove away as fast as she could, not daring to look back. But as she sped down the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The woman was there, sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes staring at Emily through the mirror. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice a rasping hiss. "You're one of us now." Emily screamed, swerving off the road and crashing into a ditch. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the woman's twisted smile, looming over her like a specter from a nightmare. The following morning, the police found Emily's car abandoned on the side of the road, the driver's seat empty. They searched the area but found no sign of her, no trace of where she had gone. St. Augustine's Hospital remains standing, its darkened windows watching over the empty streets. And in the shadows of Ward 13, a new figure stands among the others, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes hollow and distant. The line between the living and the dead has blurred once more, and St. Augustine's has claimed another soul. But the hospital isn't done yet. It waits in silence, its halls echoing with whispers, its doors ready to open for the next unwitting soul who dares to enter. Because in St. Augustine's, no one ever leaves. Not really.